Happy New Year, everyone, and welcome back to 27 Fox Place. We've finally given this outdated, beat-up bathroom a long overdue facelift. Everything in this room is worn out and outdated, and the entire space needs to be gutted, and renovating this bathroom has been at the top of my list since we moved in the house. But somehow, something more important or unexpected always seems to get in the way. But we also have a lot of things to fix around the house this year, so a complete remodel just isn't in the budget. So in the meantime, we decided to repair everything that we could do ourselves and to replace anything that couldn't be repaired without spending a lot of money. And one of the biggest challenges in this renovation was trying to update this space without replacing all of the outdated fixtures. Removing the carpet and replacing it with something more suitable for a bathroom was at the top of my list, and I couldn't get rid of it fast enough so that I could see what kind of shape the subfloor was in. But before I could get started installing the new floor, I needed to clean up the edge so that I could install a transition strip to join the new floor with the existing carpet in the bedroom. And I intentionally left the carpet a bit long so that I could decide where to put the transition, and in order to measure the length of the strip, I had to cut the carpet back a few inches and remove the padding, and once everything was cleared out of the way, I cut the strip to size with a hacksaw and made sure it fit the opening. But as you'll see a little bit later, I wasn't able to install the strip until after the floors were installed. We decided to use peel and stick vinyl planks on the floor because it was the cheapest and easiest option, and the color and style worked best with everything in the room. And peel and stick doesn't require a lot of prep work to go over an existing floor, but because we had an OSB subfloor to work with, it took a little bit more work. And you can install peel and stick directly on OSB, but the surface has to be clean so that the flooring will stick, and the vinyl will show any imperfections underneath, so it also needs to be smooth and level. And our subfloor was covered with paint and wall texture from when the house was built, so I ended up having to use an angle grinder to remove all the paint and the wall texture and to grind down the high spots. But even after using the angle grinder, there were still dents and nail heads that could show through, and the subfloor also had a few low spots that needed to be leveled out. So in the end, we decided to use leveling compound to smooth out the entire surface. Of course, like most of the projects in this makeover, replacing the carpet in the closet was more of an afterthought. We had planned on leaving the carpet in the closet to save time and money, but after we calculated how many boxes of planks that were needed for the bathroom area, we realized that we would have more than enough left over for the closet. But once we pulled up the carpet, we found that the subfloor in the closet needed the most work, which of course added more time to the project, so it ended up taking twice as long to install the new floor. So in the beginning, I wasn't sure if it was a good idea to remove the carpet from the closet, but I think it turned out to be a good decision. Once we got the floor cleaned up, the next step was to apply a primer for the leveling compound. So I just used a foam roller to apply the acrylic primer and then let it dry for a few hours. One thing I've learned by doing DIY projects is to always expect problems, and it turns out that self-leveling compound isn't quite as straightforward as you would think. It worked great for smaller patches, but larger areas seem to require a bit more finesse, and I used a trowel to spread the compound over the floor and left it to even out, but it didn't come out as smooth and even as I had hoped. So while I was trying to figure out how to fix the floor, we decided to work on a few other projects that got added to the list. And our medicine cabinet was in pretty bad shape and most of the plastic shelves were broken. But because everything in this bathroom needed to be replaced, I had to put a limit on what we could do. And because we were still planning on gutting this bathroom, I didn't want to invest a lot of money into this makeover only to have to tear it out again in a few years. So I tried to keep each project under $150. And the peel and stick tiles cost about $150, but there was another $50 for installation materials. And when I found this medicine cabinet that fit the budget, we decided to replace the old one and install a new one. And this cabinet was secured with just a few screws, so all we had to do was pull out the old cabinet and pop in the new one. And because the cabinets are something that we can still use later on, we decided to add a second cabinet to the other side. So to make sure the cabinets lined up in the same place on the wall, I transferred the measurements from the opening on the old cabinet to mark the placement for the new opening. Once I had the lines drawn out, I made a small opening so that I could peek inside to make sure there weren't any hidden surprises. And the only problem that we found was a 2x4 that we had to cut out. And you may notice that one of the cabinets is missing a bit later. We had trouble getting one of the cabinets to sit flush up against the wall, and we finally realized that the cabinet was bent, so we had to exchange it for a new one. Removing this light box was another project that got added to the list after we started this project. And I didn't want to spend a lot of money on new cabinets, so I had planned on painting the outdated oak cabinets, but I wasn't sure about what to do with this light box, and I thought about painting it white to match the trim, but when I realized that I could add recessed lighting, I couldn't get it out fast enough. Installing the new recessed lights was a pretty easy task, but it did take a little time to measure out the placement, and the biggest problem that we had was trying to calculate the number of lights that we needed for this space. We found a canless LED light with an adjustable color temperature, and the slim profile meant we didn't have to crawl through the attic to install the lights. We had electrical wire left over from another project, so all we had to do was run the wire through the ceiling, and I also knew that I wanted to add more brightness to this room. The old fixture was about 3,300 lumens, so adding 3 of the LED lights gave us the equivalent brightness of the old fixture, but because I wanted the space to be brighter than it was, we ended up adding 2 more lights on the other side. Once the floor was finally ready to install the tile, I needed to apply a coat of adhesive primer, so I just used a foam roller to apply the primer and then let it dry for a few hours. And you may notice the patchwork all over the floor. I didn't film that process, but I ended up using a feathering compound to smooth out the ridges and dips that were in the floor, and it may be overkill, but I wasn't sure how even the floor needed to be, and I didn't want to get all of the tiles installed only to see all the flaws that were underneath them. Before I started putting down the tiles, I spent a little time measuring to determine the best layout. This floor is going into 3 different rooms, and if I started square on a wall in one of those rooms, I could end up off in one of the other rooms. So I decided to snap a chalk line through the center of the bathroom that was parallel with both the cabinets and the closet, and I used that chalk line as a starting point to line up the planks. Once I had the first row down, I cut a few planks into random lengths to stagger the joints, and the whole process is pretty easy, and once the tiles are down, you can walk on them right away. The planks go down pretty quick, so the whole process should go pretty fast in a large area. But this area was small and there were a lot of obstacles to go around. Making a straight cut to shorten the length of the plank is quick and easy, but cutting around the doorways and other obstacles took a lot of time to get right, so I ended up spending most of my time cutting the planks. The tiles are pretty easy to cut, and the only tool that I needed to use was a utility knife, and I just marked the tile where I needed to cut it, and then I scored it with the knife, and there's no need to cut all the way through because the tiles will snap on the score mark. But I did notice that it's not a good idea to score the line more than once. Anytime I tried to make more than one pass with the knife, I ended up with a jagged line instead of a nice straight edge. When the house was originally built, all the baseboards were installed directly on top of the subfloor, which didn't leave any room for the floors, so all the floors in the house butt up against the baseboards. But baseboards are supposed to sit on top of the floor to allow for expansion and to clean up the gap between the floor and the wall, so it's better to remove the baseboards before you install the floor and then reinstall them after. But there's no transition between the bedroom and the bathroom, so if I raise the baseboard in the bathroom, then they don't line up with the bedroom, and then to even them out, I would have to raise all the baseboards in the rest of the bedroom. But since I want to replace the baseboards anyway, I decided not to go through all of the extra work this time. Once I finished installing the floor, I could finally add the carpet strip, so I just set the edge of the strip on top of the planks to get a nice clean edge, and then I used screws to secure it to the OSB underneath the edge of the carpet. With the floors finally finished, I was ready to start painting the cabinets, and of course, installing the floors should have been last on my list. There's a lot less risk of damage and a lot less work to protect them from damage, but since I was too impatient to wait, I had to spend a little extra time covering up the floors before I could start painting, and no matter how careful I am, I always seem to find little splatters and drops that I missed while I was painting, and I've even knocked over an entire can of paint. So I've learned it's much less work in the long run just to cover everything up. These builder-grade cabinets have seen much better days, but it's not in the budget to replace them. Originally, I thought about staining them, but because the floors have a wood finish, I decided a paint finish would work better. We had paint left over when I painted the cabinets in the bathroom downstairs, so I was able to save a little money by using the same paint color. I can't say that I have a knack for painting, but I've learned that in order to get a smooth paint finish, it's important to start with a smooth finish. So before I paint, I need to prep the surface to remove any imperfections and to scuff up the surface so that the paint will stick. So I used a sander with a 220 grit on the flat surfaces, but I had to sand by hand to get into the tight spaces. This shouldn't take a lot of effort, and it isn't necessary to sand the finish all the way down to the bare wood. I just apply enough pressure to guide the sandpaper, and the sandpaper does most of the work for me. I took all the doors and drawers outside to cut down on the mess. I removed all the hardware, but I didn't fill the holes because I had planned to reinstall the same hardware. Of course, this turned out to be a mistake because I found new hardware that doesn't match up with the existing holes, so I had to touch up the paint once I put the doors back on. I used the same 220 grit paper, and once everything was sanded, I cleaned off the dust with a damp microfiber cloth before I applied the primer. We always seem to have a can of primer left over from some little project, so I used up the last of the primer on the cabinets and let the paint dry while I repeated the same process with the face frames on the cabinets. In order to get the best finished, it's important to sand between every coat of paint. So once the primer was dry, I lightly sanded everything and wiped everything down with a damp microfiber cloth before I applied the first coat of paint. We do have an HVLP sprayer, so that's what I use to paint all the cabinets, and it's a bit more prep work to tape everything off, but the results are worth it. Painting is much faster and I get a much smoother finish, but the paint sprayer creates a lot of overspray, so I try to paint what I can outside, but using a sprayer indoors definitely requires a mask and eye protection. But because I started working outside, I completely forgot. So when I was painting the cabinets inside the house, you can see how quickly the overspray builds up in the room when I applied the first coat of paint. Unfortunately, it only took a minute to spray the cabinets, and I definitely remembered the mask when I applied the second coat. While I was waiting for the cabinets to dry, I started prepping the rest of the bathroom, and at this point I wasn't sure if I was going to reuse the same bathroom hardware or if I was going to replace it, so I decided to remove everything so that I could start with a blank slate. Of course, once I removed all the hardware, there were holes that needed to be patched up, and there was so much dust on the walls that I had to wash them with TSP before I could start painting. Bathrooms and trim are usually painted with some type of gloss finish, and fresh paint doesn't like to stick to shiny surfaces, so they need to be primed first. But I decided to take a shortcut, so I used a paint and primer combination that I got from Home Depot, and I'll be sure to leave all the information in the description box for all of the paint colors and products that I used in this video. And another thing that I learned about painting is that it's much better to cut in before you paint. Cutting in is a tedious process, and because it takes the most time, I used to start painting a room with the walls so that I could get faster results, and then I would come back later and cut in. But of course, there is a good reason that experts recommend cutting in first, and I found that I get a much better finish if I do the cutting in before I paint. We put up plastic to contain the overspray while I painted the cabinets, so when I was finished I could take down the plastic so that it was easier to get in and out of the bathroom, and I also removed the lights so that I could paint the ceiling, so I needed to pop them back in place, but I wanted to let the paint cure a little bit more before I pushed them all the way back in.
You want to wipe off the cabinet there?
Replacing this builder grade mirror is just not in the budget. I do have plans to add a frame around it, but I'm still trying to decide on what type of frame, and I would like to do something a little bit ornate, but we have a limited amount of space around the frame because of the medicine cabinet, so I may have to settle for something simple. But I want to paint behind the mirror just in case, because you never know what might turn up when you least expect it. We have a heavy texture on the walls, which makes it a huge challenge to cut in around the edges, and taping along the edge is a complete waste of time. I've tried using tape in the past, but the tape can't seal completely, so the paint gets underneath the tape, and because of the texture, I'll never get a straight line no matter what I do, so I just do the best I can with a brush. The only thing that we needed to do before we could start using the bathroom again was to replace the faucets, but before we could install the new ones, we needed to remove the old faucets and clean up the sink. But trying to remove the faucets without breaking the sinks turned out to be the hardest part of the entire project. Of course, it would have been much easier just to remove the entire vanity. And then once the faucets were out, I decided to add another project to the list. The grout on our countertops was stained and most of it was missing, so I thought it would be a good idea to refresh the grout, and at first I thought I would just recolor the old grout, but then so much of it was worn down that I decided it was better to replace it, and I thought it would be much easier to do before we put in the new faucets, and I found this little tool to remove the grout, and I was surprised how easy it was to remove until I started to work around the sink. I immediately started to regret my decision as soon as I started working on the grout around the sink. Working through all of those little lines was tedious enough, but then I found that most of the grout lines around the sink were mostly filled with mortar, which of course was hard as a rock, so it ended up being a much bigger job than when it first started out. I learn something new every time I work on a DIY project, and I learned this time around that grout is supposed to hold its shape like peanut butter, and I made a big mistake when I mixed up the grout for the countertop. I followed directions, but then I thought I had made a mistake because the grout was too stiff to work with, so I added a little bit more water, but it turned out to be too much, and a few days later all of the grout was coming out and I had to do the whole thing over again. And DIY projects can save a lot of money, but mistakes can be made that end up being costly, and fortunately the grout was less than $10, but it took another day to dig out all the grout and do it all over again. Digging out the grout wasn't too bad the first time, but as you can imagine, I wasn't too happy about doing the same job twice. But in the end, the countertops come out looking brand new again. Replacing the faucets was something that was at the top of my list, but a good quality plumbing fixture can be hundreds of dollars, and we needed 2 of them, and we also needed to stay close to $150 for the new fixtures, and we also had to try and match up the new faucets with the same style and finish of the fixtures in the shower. In the end, I had to settle for fixtures that were in the same color family so that I could stick to the budget. Once the faucets were installed, it was time to attach the new hardware so that I could hang up the cabinet doors. I left off the cabinet doors so it'd be easier to work under the sink while we installed the faucets. When I attached the hardware, I used the holes from the old hardware as a guide to rehang the doors, so the whole process was pretty easy. I had to drill pilot holes for the new hardware, so I'll need to fill in the old holes with wood putty and touch them up with paint later. Fortunately, the new hardware hides most of the holes from the old hardware, so it's not too obvious. I found a tube of caulking that matched the grout color that we used, so it matched up perfectly, and I let the grout dry for a few days before I added the caulk. And the only problem was that the tube doesn't work with the caulking gun, and it took a lot of effort to squeeze all the caulking out of the tube, but at least there wasn't very much that I needed to caulk. This makeover was long overdue, and the bathroom was outdated when we moved in, but it was in pretty good shape. But it's been slowly deteriorating over the years, and because we've always had plans to renovate, we didn't want to take the time to make repairs, but we finally reached the breaking point, and something needed to be done, even if we have to tear it all out in a few months. But I'm obsessed with how this bathroom turned out. I only regret that we didn't do this years ago. There's still a list of things that I need to finish up. I need to seal the grout, paint the trim around the doors and baseboards so that we can hang the doors back up, and I still need to organize and decorate, so that will be in part 2 of this makeover. I hope you enjoyed this transformation and that it gives you ideas for your space. And remember to give this video a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button so that you don't miss part 2 of this makeover. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you next time.